Turtles all the way down. I'm Jake, sometimes Jenk. We had a smart young man by the name of Kyle Lumsden come into the studio to discuss what he's learned during his research into drug policy. And, whenever you think about drug policy and talk about drug policy, you come onto this notion of a war on drugs that we as a culture, particularly in North America, have been engaged in for some time now. And it's almost universally agreed that it's been a complete failure. And, that is, there's a lot of reasons for that. And maybe we get into some of it here in the discussion. When you think about war on drugs, it's always been kind of motivated and, pushed along by something other than science, something other than rationality. It seemed to be very much politically motivated in the past. You've got the story of William Randolph Hearst, who was the subject of Citizen Kane. For example, he owned a bunch of newspapers and newsprint, businesses, and hemp was coming along as a threat to his newsprint business. So all of a sudden, these articles started appearing in his newspapers about how terrible a social phenomenon cannabis was. And in fact, it was, cynically chosen to be called marijuana because it implied that it was a Mexican thing. There's a lot of racism built into it. Also, African Americans were more likely to use it. So it's always had this racist element into it. And in fact, when you got into the late 60s, we had kind of a resurgence in psychedelic drugs. And, someone in the embodiment of Richard Nixon realized that a lot of his opposition to his politics came from certain groups of people, certain demographics, certain cultural points in America that tended to probably more likely use such things as psychedelics. And as a result, there's actual tape recordings of him talking where he says, let's just criminalize it heavily. LSD and marijuana made them all Schedule I drugs. And as a result, you have an excuse to basically lock up a group of people that disproportionately make up the opposition to that type of politics that Nixon was embodying. So we've been kind of paying for this culturally over time, over the last several decades, in which you have a culture in which poor, black, Mexican, basically establishment types getting disproportionately arrested, put into the criminal justice system. As a result, many of these people aren't then able to vote. So that's very convenient for those powers to eliminate the opposition in such a way that, once they become a convict, they can't even vote. So, we see that there's a lot going on there that doesn't really make sense. America was kind of built on this, obviously it's central to its being is this notion of liberty. And it seems to go very much at odds with this concept and this thing that we hold high and dear. Here I am, I'm almost a 50-year-old guy here. And it seems preposterous to me that I am not allowed to legally try these things and decide for myself. Of course, there's some danger in it, as there is in alcohol, as there is in mountain climbing. But we allow these pursuits unless it harms others. Then of course it becomes a legal issue. And if it harms yourself, this, in a sense that you're endangering yourself irrationally to an extent that doesn't seem acceptable, then we can understand that there might be some regulations required. Of course there are. So we have an example in Portugal that I think about 15, 16 years ago decided to decriminalize all drugs. So not just the ones that I seem to advocate for, which is like cannabis and the psychedelics like psilocybin and LSD, but they decriminalized all of them, all of the ones that I would even consider dangerous and not likely to teach you much, which is, like the heroin and cocaine and meth and crack and all that. And an interesting experiment, has revealed that, culturally, societally, legally, that's very much a success. What you have is fewer people using drugs, fewer people that are addicted to drugs. The costs of the criminal justice system go way down. Treatment is much cheaper than locking somebody up. But again, here we go back to the political, in that there's a lot of groups that are very much interested in perpetuating this war on drugs because it helps their constituencies, like, for example, police forces, jail guards, pharmaceutical companies are very much, supporting the continued crackdown on such things, because they're able to, rather than, have the situation where people are using essentially drugs that are or free from, the control of the pharmaceutical industries. You can't patent MDMA or cannabis or LSD. These are public domain things. And as a result, there's not much money to be made in, growing and marketing a business for it. So the pharmaceutical companies don't like that. And there's a lot of lobbying going on to make sure that the war on drugs continues. But thanks to the open communications that we find in such media as the internet, and the growth of podcasts in particular seems to be some aspect of our culture that seems to be taking this seriously, talking about it at great length, and I think making a lot of progress in, putting some kind of sense back into this whole thing. It's more about safety. It should be a medical thing, not a criminal thing, and that's becoming clear to a lot of people. So I always take these kind of things back to my personal experience. Of course, this whole podcast is kind of about that. As I say, it's kind of like a free therapy for myself, and hopefully it helps others to see things in certain lights as well. So in my case, I do actually engage in a lot of experimentation with psychedelics, and I have been consuming cannabis pretty much every day over the last year or two. And I got to say that in my personal case, I think I realized that there I think I did realize that there is potentially some harm coming to me if I do it too much. And I've been noticing this. And over the last few guests that we've had, we've had discussions where I've been talking more about this. And with Kyle here, we talked more explicitly about a drug policy. And my next guest is going to be a psychologist that studies the brain and its cognitive performance with regard to aging, for example. And in my case, I noticed. I'll tell you a story that kind of made me notice something was amiss. There was a time, maybe a couple of weeks ago, I woke up that day and I felt great, and this is. Maybe in the middle of a cold winter, sometimes more unusual than maybe it should be. And, I felt great physically, emotionally. I was looking forward to the evening where I was going to have a date with a beautiful woman. Everything is looking great. But, before I went out to that date, I had this notion that just kept kind of humming around in the back of my head thinking, this is going to be a great day, a great evening. Wouldn't it be better if I had half a hit of LSD and see how that goes in terms of, taking an already good situation and see what could be done with it? I quickly realized after taking it that it was probably a mistake. I mean, in the sense that it's already a good situation. Why do I need to add something to it? It seemed like an irresponsible use for it. And it kind of turned out to be true in the sense that I don't think it helped the date. I think it probably made the evening a little bit more, maybe more, I don't know, chaotic in my own emotional sense, a little bit maybe too energetic. There's kind of a disparity between the person that you're with. If I'm heightened in a sense that I've got a lot more internal energy and passion going on and the other person doesn't, it's not really a meeting of minds in that sense. So I realize that I'm starting to use it in ways that are probably not in a way that's going to teach me something. And another thing I noticed also during times when I do, or stretches of time when I'm maybe engaged in some psychedelic experimentation a little more than I should, I do notice more volatility. I do notice more depression and anxiety, more likely to go up and down very quickly. Mood changes, mood swings tend to be more pronounced. I'm going to say not as bad as maybe they used to be when I was younger. It kind of felt like when I was younger, the whole of my growth was basically trying to deal with this constant passionate fluctuation that goes up and down in my energies and moods, and I feel like over time, as I had these lessons in life and emotional growth, that I was able to get better at that. And cannabis, to be honest, has been very good for my anxiety. I have some anxiety issues here and there. But I've been noticing lately, as I do it more and it becomes a regular feature of my daily life, that it's probably not working as it used to. I mean, well, for one thing, I don't really seem to get, as they say in quotation marks, stoned when I take cannabis these days. It's more of it's starting to feel more like a habit. It probably does you maybe reduce my anxiety somewhat, so there's likely a good reason to take it for that, but I don't need it as much, and I've realized this. And over the last week or so, I've kind of instituted this kind of a control mechanism from outside. So I've given myself, I guess, rules in a way of, what time of day that I can start to use such a thing, how many times psychedelics are allowed in a week, only on weekends. And eventually I'm going to be titrating myself over the stretch of a few months to get it less and less. What I'd like to arrive at is somewhere where I can maybe smoke the odd joint here and there at nights only, and maybe psychedelics once a month, as opposed to, I've gone down stretches of time where I've maybe done it, let's see, the most of my life is probably 10 or dozen times in a month, which is preposterously a high number of times to be doing that. I realize that. And I'd like it to be maybe once a month. So the experiment for me is to try this process of reducing it. And already I've started to notice positive effects. I feel more vigorous. I feel more engaged. Yesterday I had a situation where I had 3 different social appointments to meet 3 different people to have a coffee or a drink or lunch with. And on maybe just even a few weeks ago, that might have caused me a great deal of anxiety. And, in terms of feeling like I might not have the proper energy to pull this off. And I'd start worrying about, well, I got to make sure I slept enough the night before. And what happens when I do that, of course, is when you worry about sleeping, you get insomnia. So this sort of thing starts to happen. But with this less chaotic internal system that I'm having over the last week or two, I'm finding a bit more calm, and I think I made a good decision in moving towards that. And another thing, going back to that, so that night, in the middle of that week, when I had that half a dose of LSD to go along with my night out, as I said, it wasn't the best thing to do. The next day, I started doing some home renovation with a friend, and I just did not feel well at all. And my body is basically at that point telling me something is wrong. And maybe it takes me a while to listen to my body sometimes. It's something that I've had to learn to do over time. As a younger man, I would ignore the signals from my body. I would always think of, even fatigue and, stomach issues, muscle pain. I would just think, oh, well, I just need to get over that. I just need to push that aside and move along. It's only, these are signals that are just kind of hysterically trying to stop me from doing things that I think I should be doing. And I would often ignore that. But I've learned over the years to listen more. And so that day, after that half a dose, when I'm not feeling well, I'm doing some home renovation, I just start to feel nauseous and I start vomiting. Well, I was able to get to the bathroom, so don't worry. And it's almost like there's metaphorically speaking, like a demon is kind of working at inside, trying to get this message out. Get these. It's kind of like your body is revolting, and so I did that. And while I'm doing that, while I'm essentially purging, I pretty much decide right at that moment, oh, this is not working. This is too much. I'm definitely going to do something. And at that moment, I actually, and I remember saying, well, I'm going to stop it entirely. I'm going to take, all of these out of my system and see what happens. But a strange thing happens after that. So in that state of mind, when I'm feeling nauseous and terrible, I make that decision because I'm that person making that decision. And then once all of that has been purged out, I start to feel good again. I lie down for a bit. I close my eyes. I start having what turn out to be some very interesting thoughts and ideas. I start to think back about my childhood. I start to have some insights about my mother and father and, while I was growing up and all of these things. I start to have the positive effects and experiences that you have in a psychedelic trip. So here I am after the purging. Essentially, I'm a different person. And this person that's lying down and having a good experience saying, oh, you know what, I don't need to stop completely. Maybe I'll think of something else. And so, I realize that there's this back and forth, and it's almost like I can't really rely on either one of those, maybe. And, I start thinking, okay, so maybe while I'm vomiting in the bathroom and feeling terrible, maybe that's not the best time to make the decision for my life. But also, it's also not the best time to make that decision when you're having a kind of a good trip, when you're having these profound ideas, because that's also not a consistently persistent way of being for myself. So later on, after some clearing of my system, I'm able to think this through. I think, okay, I'm going to initiate this process, and I've actually written down a couple of regulations, as I mentioned, and it's going well. So I'll let you know how that goes over time. And the other thing to notice and realize is that if I can't successfully get through this process of titration, then that's going to be a signal to me that that I lack the power to do it. That maybe I need to completely stop, and that's likely to be the result of this. Now, it's kind of difficult for me to say this, and maybe that's also an indication that there's some kind of addiction type process going on here, because it seems like a very difficult thing to do. And so I guess I'm kind of rooting for my willpower to be able to get through this. I think I'm going to be okay, and get better use out of these, better therapeutic use out of these psychedelics than maybe I have been when I go into these stretches where I'm doing too much of it. And when I got to thinking about that upcoming day where I'm going to have a bunch of social engagements, as I said, I tend to get a little nervous, a little social anxiety. And what I noticed is that what I often worry about is really my energy levels. It's really usually about my energy levels. I'm always kind of, this is kind of an ideal for me. When I engage with somebody, ideally what I'd like is to be completely present. That's not something that comes to me easily. It's something that I actually have to work at. I'm getting better at it, but it's exhausting. It's exhausting in a good way. I mean, when I engage with people, it's exhausting, it's tiring, but that's not to say that it's a criticism. It's exhausting and tiring, like, maybe playing sports. It's wonderful. You get a great, rewards from it, but it's exhausting. Or maybe like sex, for example. It's kind of exhausting sometimes, but you're not complaining about that. So it seemed to me that if I can figure out a way to control these internal energies within me, to redirect them, it could be very beneficial to me. And I realize that there's all these ancient technologies that already exist. And, I think of something like Tai Chi, for example, that seems to be, from what very little I know about it, seems to be basically concerned with that sort of thing, where you're trying to figure out and understand. And in my case, what I'd like to do, and what I've found I'm able to do when I'm engaged in a psychedelic trip with psilocybin, for example, I'm able to notice these energies, to like anxiety, for example, and acknowledge them, and also find a way to kind of transform them, redirect them into some other kind of energy that turns out to be positive within me. And it almost seems like there's kind of an infinite resource of all of this energy that's coming in and going out of your system. This the cyclonic activity that we call yourself. All this energy that's coming and going and pulsing itself through you, if you can find a way to channel it in certain ways, it's going to be a good thing. And as a result, I'm gonna take up some Tai Chi, I think. And of course, yoga has a lot to do with this. A lot of these old physical, emotional, psychological type tools that I call technologies that already are there for us to use, I'm going to take advantage of. I'll let you know how that goes. Well, in the meantime, we've got this conversation coming up with Kyle Lumsden. Hope you enjoy it. Talk soon.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
So there's definitely a correlation between substance use and mental health problems and going to prison and general sort of life disruption.
And it seems like it's kind of a chicken egg thing, isn't it? I mean, like which is causing which, and it's almost like there's kind of a positive feedback loop. You know, if you have a mental health issue, you might be more likely to have substance abuse, and if you are doing that, you're more likely to end up in jail, and on it goes, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, like what you said, it's definitely very cyclical and tied together. So, sometimes it'll be sort of someone who grows up in poverty, has experienced some type of childhood trauma, use substances to escape, or things like that. Normally, the major substance involved in mental health problems is alcohol because it's so socially acceptable and available and less stigma for using it. So, I'd say poverty, addiction, trauma, prisons, all of those tied together. And same thing with some other problems such as affordable housing, job markets, employment being precarious. I think it's very hard to sort of talk about one without all the other factors. But once you talk about all the other factors, it gets very complicated and it's difficult to solve from a policy standpoint.
Yeah. So is there some personal life experience that led you to this area of research? Is there what triggered an interest in it?
Well, I know people who have had problems with substances, both alcohol, tobacco, and prescription medications, and also illicit narcotics. I have a friend who sort of was doing heroin and got into some problems with that. So it is a personal level. And I find that most people who are involved in drug policy activism do have some type of personal reasoning behind why they got involved. So, and I had a few family members who are alcoholics and problems like that. So, but my initial interest in drug policy and harm reduction came mostly from an academic standpoint, where I just randomly kind of picked to write a research paper on supervised injection sites and Insight in Vancouver in particular, and that kind of got the ball rolling mentally for me. So, and then after I wrote that paper, which was my second year, I started to look for some organizations that I could get involved in, and that's what led me to the Canadian Students for Sensible Drug Policy, which is the organization I'm part of, which is a Canadian national organization with different chapters at different universities, which pushes drug policy reform issues.
I've started to see a lot of people talking about this the last couple of years, where you weren't getting much traction on the issue before. I guess social media probably has a lot to do with that. Do you think people, have we turned the tide in terms of becoming more rational in the way we respond to these issues, rather than the way we have been in the past, which is kind of really fear-based and misinformation?
Well, I think the rising tide, there's two big issues right now in Canadian drug policy, in my opinion. The first is obviously marijuana legalization. So it seems like we have sort of turned a cultural corner in regards to marijuana legalization and regulation. So that's an interesting topic moving forward. And the second major issue is the overdose crisis of impure opioid agonists of synthetic opioids, such as fentanyl and carfentanil, making its way into Canada, mostly in British Columbia, and causing a lot of recent overdose deaths. However, I think that there's cycles of panic when it comes to drugs, which goes back a very long time in history, to the first opium laws made in Canada, which were about Chinese immigrants, and then with marijuana laws related to Mexico and Mexican immigrants, and then crack cocaine in America related to black people. So there's been a wide variety of different drug problems coming to the top of the agenda and then maybe fading or coming back. So in the 1990s, there was a really big sort of moral panic or focusing events such as overdose deaths and HIV rates in Vancouver. So that's what spawned the creation of the supervised injection sites there.
Right.
So I'm not sure how different right now is compared to the mid-90s or other eras, but it does seem like with the advent of social media, more awareness is coming.
Yeah. I mean, some of the things you mentioned seems to point the finger at a lot of political reasons that some of these, policies were taken. Well, obviously, they're always political in one sense, but what I mean by that is not based on research, but more based on expediency and whatever their policy goals happen to be, whether they wanted to, demonize a certain group. That happened to be one path towards that. I'm also curious as to, have you ever thought, like, why is it that people are so passionately against altering your consciousness in the first place? Like, what is going on there? It seems like there seems to be a very fundamental kind of a fear reaction for a lot of people, particularly the people that haven't experienced that sort of a transformation in their lives. It's puzzling sometimes to see that reaction. Do you ever give thought to, why, what's going on there?
Yeah, I think that's a very good point and a difficult point, because it really is based on morality arguments that go back into probably the 1800s England. Same thing with like the temperance era arguments. I mean, it really is based on morality, and some of it is based on religion and concept.
But if it's morality, for example, are they, and this sometimes they arrive at this by saying, well, or thinking that I want to outlaw this because if a lot of people did it, society would crumble or something like that, or we wouldn't be able to work or efficient, or they have that kind of a capitalist kind of a efficiency argument in that I want this to be due on to everyone because it'll be better for the system at large. I mean, there's some sense that kind of a moralistic argument.
Right, and I think that's rooted in best intentions. That, I
usually
feel like
is. Yeah,
the people on the far right, conservatives, even some people on the left who are anti or who are pro drug prohibition, they want what's best for society, right. And I can sort of agree with them also because everybody has been socialized in this way, that you grow up thinking drugs are bad, and but there's an interesting sort of cognitive dissonance of if you get high on opiates, then you're a bad person. If it's a prescription, it's okay, but if it's on the street, you're a bad person. If you use marijuana, there's certain connotations with that. Psychedelic drugs, each one has its own sort of strange moralized philosophy against it. I think a lot of it does come from what I mentioned before about sort of our history of othering other groups. And one group I didn't mention was that when there was initial contact between the settlers and the indigenous of the Americas, the settlers came across groups that were using psychedelics, mainly mushrooms. And that initial experience also colored it, that there was a lot of demonizing of the indigenous, of the way they acted as them being sort of barbaric and not believing in God as our conception of it. I think a lot of it goes back to sort of fundamental psychological components of wanting to feel superior maybe, or being scared of things you don't understand or you don't have a lot of contact with. So.
Yeah, I guess it always kind of boils down to something like that. And there's in particular, the religious or the religious community's objections to it is always kind of fascinating to me as well, because it kind of gets right to the root of it. It's basically, it's about your reality. It's kind of a battle of what is real. And, it's kind of a metaphysical reaction to it. It's almost like, a lot of religions are based on this notion that they have this sense of a different reality above and beyond ours. So when something like psychedelics also claims to provide such a other state that is in some sense similar, I guess it's kind of, is it invading their turf? Is that,
Yeah, it could be sort of an alternative to the sort of hegemonic message that they are delivering. And I think, a lot of the stigma against drug users comes from sort of the language that they use, like clean versus dirty, and just the general stigma that has developed over all of these years for certain type of drug users. And something interesting with religion is that religion has sanctified the use of alcohol, which is a mind-altering drug, which causes a lot of population-level, individual-level problems. But Jesus' blood was wine,
and a really shitty drug.
It's. I just recently wrote
It's like sniffing glue to me. It's like it's kind of on that level of sophistication for the high.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's classified as a depressant,
Right.
not because it makes you depressed, but because it does certain things to your brain to slow you down, and sort of slow your functioning.
But compared to like LSD or something, it's no contest.
Or even marijuana, or
yeah.
even stimulants.
Sure.
That I mean, if you were to have a room full of people and let's say you had 10 people, you give them all 10 heroin, you give all 10 of them meth, you give all 10 of them alcohol, you give all 10 of them marijuana, so on and so forth. The time when they take alcohol will be the time when there's most risk of violence and aggression.
Sure.
So each substance, and that's the interesting thing too about drug policy in general, is that we group drugs together, especially the scheduling of the way the government has done it. I mean, including heroin and even cocaine in the same sort of category is weird because they're so incredibly different. They have such different effects. They have such different issues in regards to the production, manufacture, trade, everything. So. There's just a lot of misinformation and ignorance when it comes to the topic of drug policy.
Mm-hmm. And it sounds like, maybe your predecessors were kind of like running into windmills, but it might be easier for you in your career to try and get this overturned. I mean, we also have some examples to point to. And Portugal in particular seems like a fascinating case study. From what I've heard about it. Maybe I'm hearing it from the liberal biased media. I don't know. But it seems like it's been an overwhelming success, for the most part. And so when you have something to point to, it's just harder to resist, it seems.
Yeah, that's right. So in 2000, I believe it was between 2001 and 2003, Portugal decriminalized all drugs. So you could have 10 days worth of drugs on you, which is a strange kind of arbitrary amount. But you can have 10 days worth of personal drugs on you. And if you get caught with that, you'll go through drug courts. You won't necessarily get a record. There are some problems with the drug courts. But yeah, the generalized evidence that they found, they did studies 10 years after the implementation of the policy, and they found decreased overdose deaths, more people in rehab centers, and far less burden on the health and justice systems. So
and fewer addicts, which was interesting, right?
Yeah,
it diminishes the number of,
so Portugal, Czech Republic is moving in a similar direction. The Netherlands has a more liberalized policy. So Western Europe is probably the most progressive in regards to drug policy. Australia also is moving in that direction. The United States moving in the opposite direction. And then, East Asia, Central America, Africa, some of those places, very draconian drug laws, especially in East Asia.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of, there's a bit of confusion here where we are in Canada and in Ontario. Nobody really seems to know what the status is for cannabis right now, because I can go down half a block from my house and buy it from a store. So what is the situation? You might be following this a little closer.
Yeah, so it is pretty schizophrenic at this point in the sense that they have been applying it not uniformly as of yet. So I was recently in BC, and the British Columbia dispensaries are not getting rated at the same rates as the Toronto dispensaries. And I think this is partially the federal government's fault for not clarifying that we need to stop arresting people, because I believe in 2016 a very high number, in the tens of thousands of Canadians, got new records for marijuana possession. And I had met a few of them. I met a student who was 19 years old who was working in a dispensary, and the dispensary got raided when he was inside, and now he has a trafficking charge. So this was in May of this past year during the Project Claudia raids. So I spoke with him. He was getting a petition for help with his legal funding. So yeah, it was just weird. But on the other hand, I do agree with I don't necessarily like the proliferation of unregulated cannabis shops.
Yeah, it seems kind of like the Wild West right now. And maybe that's gone a little too far too.
That's right. So, I mean, starting it without the proper quality control regulations. I saw a study recently on some legal marijuana they were selling in California had a lot of mold on it.
Yeah.
So there was, just because they're selling it apparently legally doesn't necessarily mean that it has the same level of quality control as a winery has, for example. Mm-hmm. So that's difficult as well. In Toronto, there's been a host of robberies of people targeting these dispensaries because they know they can't call the cops right now. So
right. And it's an all cash business, and
so much cash going in and out of those dispensaries. So it's a perfect vulnerable group for violent criminals to
definitely.
Yeah, same thing with, which has always been one of the problems with criminalization, is that drug dealers, in another sense, prostitutes, anybody who is engaging in these type of black market illicit activities are extremely vulnerable to criminals who want to take advantage of them because they have no recourse for justice.
Mm-hmm. Do you when I heard I was going to be having a conversation with you, and you seem to know a great deal about these things, I also wondered. I hope that you might know some of the medical science about it as well. I don't know if you've looked into the neuroscience of these things, or is that some part of it?
Somewhat, I have.
Yeah.
And
well, one of the reasons is because I do a lot of this myself.
So you want to make sure your brain is
I want to
okay.
know if I'm
what you're doing to your brain.
Am I going to be okay?
Well, again, what I was saying before, you can't just say drugs are bad for you.
Right.
Like that's, it's hard to say which drug you're talking about. Mm-hmm. And one of the main things I've learned from some other sort of more veterans in drug policy and more the sort of the chemistry aspect of it is that when it comes to drug use, for all drugs, there's a sliding scale of benefit to harm. Mm-hmm. So on one side of the coin, you can have someone who maybe takes mushrooms once a year, has a spiritual experience, it's amazing, it's helping their life, it's it's not harming their body or mind. Mm-hmm. And then you could have someone who takes it every week and is abusing it, or at least having bad times. It's harming their life, it's harming their loved ones, and both of those things are true. Mm-hmm. And it's not one or the other per se, but there's always a sort of a sliding scale. So someone who smokes pot once a week or once a month is different from someone who smokes pot 5 times a day. Mm-hmm. And even someone who smokes pot 5 times a day, though, can be okay. That's not even... but in regards to brain chemistry, I know surprisingly that the psychedelic drugs are clean for your brain and internal organs, that they do MRI scans on your body while people are under the influence of mushrooms and LSD and DMT. And they didn't show any harmful, they're not toxic for your organs. So, and that's actually, I believe, similar with opiates, in that opiates cause physical dependency, but they are not as toxic for your internal organs as certain other substances.
Especially where they adulterate these substances with all kinds of other things that you don't know what you're getting in many cases.
That is definitely one of the main harms of criminalization. I always use the example that you would never go to the LCBO and buy a bottle of wine that makes you go blind, because you know that the government is ensuring quality of control. But I know that there's been some research that's political on marijuana and your brain, and especially heavy marijuana use for teenagers resulting in schizophrenia or the onset of schizophrenia. I think there's a lot of political research going into this. So it can be hard to sort of distinguish, because I know there's people on the right who are trying to publish think tank articles saying that, it's very harmful, it's bad for your brain. There's people on the left, who are trying to say, no, the research isn't conclusive. So I think it's difficult. One other annoying thing about drug criminalization is that there's been not enough research on any of these substances.
Sure, yeah, that's the problem.
It's very hard to know.
But one important question that's important for me, and you just kind of brought it up, there's always been these stories about the person who, for example, had an acid trip and was never the same, or became schizophrenic or something. And we've heard these kind of stories, but it's very few of them are firsthand in the first place. But I think and even if these stories are true, it seems to me that they're always young men or women in their 20s. And isn't that the time when you're likely to be schizophrenic, start showing symptoms of it anyway? And is my assumption correct that it might be more related to that than the actual psychedelics?
Yeah, that's. I think that's a fair point, and that's
because you never hear of like a guy in his 40s taking acid for the first time and going schizophrenic. It just doesn't happen.
Right.
So what's that?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, that could be the guy in his 40s has done it a lot, and his brain sort of he knows himself, he knows his mind, he knows his body. But I do think that something in regards to schizophrenia, it does manifest usually late teens, early 20s. So it's difficult to disentangle the cause. So they could have became schizophrenic anyway. It could have been triggered by marijuana, psychedelics, cocaine. Not really sure. See, it's
an important question, I think.
Yeah, absolutely.
If it does have that capacity, then I would agree. Don't touch it until you're past that, because from in my own case, I didn't really do it until I was in my late 30s, early 40s, to be honest. And,
LSD.
LSD, psychedelics in general, and even cannabis. I smoked it a few times in school. It never seemed to have an effect on me, so I gave up on the idea. And to be honest, I thought some of my friends were faking it when they were stoned, because it just didn't have an effect on me. And I really didn't get stoned on it until, late 30s for the first time. And I'm kind of glad that I did, because I think maybe the young mind or the young brain is, neurochemically susceptible to something that I may not be.
That is definitely true. And my entire sort of mantra is harm reduction. So, when people sort of learn that I'm involved in drug policy, they get this idea that I'm trying to spread drugs, and I want people to do drugs, which is almost the opposite, in the sense that I'm more so just realistically admitting that people do drugs, and that you should reduce the harm from it.
And you want them to be safe.
Yeah, and I want them to be safe, and I don't want them to go to jail, and I'd like their lives to be good, for them to be productive, all the good stuff, making a society a better place. But I do agree that drug use is better. It's started later in life, so the later you can hold off on it, the better. But that's me being a bit naive, because nobody starts. Well, I guess you do, but very few.
I get that
people,
it's probably a rare occurrence. Yeah,
very few people start using drugs, especially alcohol or marijuana, in their 20s. It starts in their teens. Starts 14, 15, 16. So recently, I was actually part of a panel or a workshop with some people from a group called the International Center for Science and Drug Policy, as well as my group, CSSDP. And we were discussing sort of the details of marijuana legalization, and the government came out initially saying they wanted it at the age of 25. So you had to be 25 to buy legal pot, which is absurd, because just nobody is doing that. At least nobody's starting at 25.
That would be hard to enforce anyway.
Yeah, it'd be hard to enforce, and it'd be making an additional black market and criminalization of youth, which is what you don't want to do. But as far as psychedelics and mental health,
but see, I guess this is kind of where you kind of fit in the middle, because you don't. What do you do between banning it and completely legalizing it?
Yeah.
What can we do in between? And I guess this is the kind of thing that you're thinking about.
Yeah, so the model in Portugal, which we referenced, was not full legalization and regulation.
It was decriminalization, right?
Yeah, right. Yeah. So that's kind of it is a weird middle ground, where they're saying you can possess drugs, you can't manufacture drugs, and you can't sell drugs. So it is kind of a head in the sand. Where are they getting it? Who's profiting from it? You're not decreasing the black market, which is the main source of violence. So it is difficult. However, I do agree that full legalization and regulation could result in the social acceptability issue that alcohol has. That the reason alcohol has such a disproportionate amount of harm for psychoactive drugs is because of the social acceptability. I think alcohol is unique. Tobacco is unique because we've evolved with them over centuries. I think if you legalized methamphetamine tomorrow, you wouldn't do meth. The average person would not be going out and using meth. The people who do use meth would be able to get meth that was of pure quality, safe smoking equipment, and so one of the things too is that places like Insight in Vancouver, where you can do the heroin in front of nurses, in Portugal, a lot of it they have ramped up mental health. So let's say you have some type of drugstore that sells illegal drugs, cocaine, methamphetamine. At that store, you would also have a wide variety of sort of resources and outreach to those people, saying, "Hey, we know you're doing this. Are you sure you're happy with this? Do you want any alternatives to get into treatment, to get prevented, to get help? Here's some, housing options. Here's some health options for condoms, clean needles. Yada, yada, yada."
That makes too much sense, man.
Right, yeah. But I mean, I can see and I've had this argument with my friends too, saying, if you can go into the store and buy some spectacularly addictive cocaine, is that good for society? Then, you're sort of making it socially acceptable that might increase rates of use. Which is it's possible.
It's a reasonable argument.
Yeah.
And it would be interesting to have a sense of how much of that is true and how far that would go in influencing that. Because, it's bound to have some influence.
I think if you legalize drugs and push them, like if you were to have, the government has ads going,
like they do for
cocaine.
Gambling, like they do for gambling right now, which is kind of preposterous. Yeah,
right.
I hope they wouldn't move to that.
Mm-hmm. Gambling is an interesting topic too, actually, just very briefly, because I think the addiction to gambling and the dopamine spikes in your brain from gambling prove that problematic drug use is not just about the substance, because people get as addicted to gambling and have as many harmful effects in their life from gambling as you can from drugs. Even more so, because you can lose vast sums of money, which causes relationship breakdown, lose your property, et cetera, et cetera. So I actually want to write an article on the relationship between what gambling does to your brain and what drugs do to your brain.
Yeah, and in the gambling case, it seems even more insidious, because I'm quite sure that they're designing the play interface, taking into consideration those dopamine spikes and harming you in the process. It's not likely to be a good, habit-forming type behavior that they're putting you through.
Absolutely not. Yeah. And everybody knows the house always wins, and that is not even or equal. And so it is. It's the government, again, choosing what vices are acceptable and to profit from, and what vices we've decided are unacceptable. So that is interesting. But we can talk a little more about psychedelics if you want, because I know some research on that pretty well.
Well, the dopamine versus serotonin thing seems to be an important differentiator in terms of which endorphins it's acting on, which neurotransmitters it's acting on. From what I can gather, I seem to prefer the serotonin-related psychedelics. As dopamine-type things don't seem to appeal to me, like the cocaine and that sort of thing. Do you know the differentiating between that? Is that?
No, I don't know too much about the exactly what's happening in your brain in regards to dopamine.
I don't think anybody does. It seems like it seems to be at that stage where it's not quite certain to a lot of people yet, and there's still a lot of room for debate. It's one of those things where they know the results of it, but they don't necessarily know the mechanism at play.
I just thought of something also about the legalization argument, sort of, that it would increase drug use. So I believe that problematic drug use is largely rooted in other factors. So it's rooted, like I said, in poverty and trauma, in crappy relationships, in isolation, etc. So I think that if you can sort of have like a general reform, so if you take all the money that we spend on policing drug use and the amount of drug offenders in prison, and sort of push that money into upstream initiatives like more affordable housing and more mental health care, that would decrease drug use in general. So the happier and more content the society, the less problematic drug use you're going to have. So, I mean, if the state were to legalize and push drugs, and a lot of people are poor, a lot of people don't have housing, a lot of people are, miserable, more or less, then you would have a lot of problematic drug use. But if you open up drugs and you have low unemployment rates, low homelessness, general positive predictors for a society, then you could have a model of regulation similar to alcohol, where the people who did do it were doing it anyway, but they're doing it safely, and less people would be doing it in general because more people would be happy.
And are we allowed to do therapeutic research in Canada on these on psychedelics? Is it different than in the U.S.?
Yeah, so what I know right now is most of the research on psychedelics is being done in Baltimore. There's a university in Baltimore, the Johns Hopkins, and in England. So as what I know right now is that there's no current psychedelic research happening in Canada.
Wow.
Canada was a trailblazer, although I'm not positive on that. There could be that I don't know of, but I don't believe so. Canada was a trailblazer for psychedelic research, though, in the 1950s and 1960s. In Saskatchewan, there was a researcher, professor named, I think it was Harry Osmond, not sure the first name, but his last name was Osmond, and he treated, I believe it was between 40 and 50,000 people for alcoholism using LSD.
All right. Yeah.
So that was a part of Canadian psychedelic research history. It was discontinued in the 70s. A lot of it was, a lot of the problems come from the Nixon era administration rhetoric of this war on drugs, common. But there is right now a robust amount of psychedelic research occurring. I know most of the different ones.
Have you seen any interesting results coming up? Yeah. What's going on there?
So one of the most interesting ones for me is that psychedelic drug use to treat addiction. So what I just mentioned there about people who are dependent on alcohol did have success rates for those studies using LSD. A lot of those studies done in the 50s, near the middle of the century, were not as rigorous as what you would have today as far as scientific testing goes and controls and all these other things. So it's hard to take those ones overly seriously. But right now at the Johns Hopkins University, they did a study in 2015 where they had 15 people who were lifelong cigarette smokers, I think average age of 40. None of them had ever done any illicit narcotics before, and they all took one dose of psilocybin mushrooms in a therapeutic setting with a nurse and a psychiatrist and a doctor. And then at the 1 year mark after that, 12 out of 15 had quit smoking, which is an 80% success rate. And the normal success rates for quitting tobacco, I think, is between 15 and 25%.
Wow.
So it was almost 4 times more efficient, better efficacy than the traditional methods of that. So the main finding in general is that there seems to be something about the psychedelic experience that can cause personality changes and less self-harmful behavior. So, the mushrooms for smoking. They also had one about mushrooms for people with anxiety related to end-of-life cancer. So there's a really nice documentary called Understanding the Science, A New Understanding the Science of Psilocybin. I screened it at U of T last year. And it shows sort of like some old ladies taking mushrooms. They have cancer and relieving their stress about dying. Right. So they had personality changes afterwards where they were nicer to their caregiver, more accepting. And psychedelics have just historically been used for spiritual experiences, and that one of the words for psychedelics is entheogen, which is to evoke a spiritual experience. The other research on psychedelics right now is they're using ketamine, which is not a traditional psychedelic, but it's in the classification of dissociative, which is some type of animal tranquilizer. Small doses makes you feel like you're drunk, but large doses can give you a dissociative sort of hallucinogenic experience. And they've found that it's been working for major depression, to relieve major depression. MDMA, which again is not a classical psychedelic, but is in the family.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure where to put that.
Yeah, it's classified as a type of psychedelic. Not one of the classical psychedelics are LSD, mushrooms, DMT, and ayahuasca.
Yeah.
But MDMA has been shown to treat PTSD. So something about the sort of positive feeling you get from MDMA and the ability to open up helps. They found veterans who come back after seeing terrible things that they can take MDMA in a therapeutic setting and it relieves those symptoms.
I have my own personal experience theories about what's going on in the psychedelic state. In my case, it seems like I become more aware of the various parts of me as somewhat separate processes at play. And I'm become more aware of these, I've started calling them cyclones in a way, these processes and effects that are at play against each other, sometimes working against each other. When I'm in a psychedelic state, I'm able to be aware of it and also kind of bring peace among them in a sense, and find some kind of a better harmony, which does translate into the waking life when you realize that, that it's actually kind of an arbitrary setting that I have. My anxiety is kind of an arbitrary setting that I can just, if I want, I can actually switch it off. You kind of get that sense when you're on psychedelics. And it sticks sometimes for months after, So yeah, it does work. Mm-hmm. Who knows why? It seems to be related to serotonin, but...
well, I always sort of viewed it as drugs like alcohol and opiates can sort of numb you. And just in my sort of opinion about what I know about these substances, that those can sort of dull your senses and serve as an escape. Whereas psychedelic drugs are the opposite.
That's right. That's why they're appealing, I think.
To a certain segment. Mm-hmm. I would say that the people who seek psychedelic drug experiences are probably in a category of demographic that is more adventurous or thrill-seeking.
Curious, for
sure. Same people who like roller coasters, maybe. Just because it is such a...
They like challenges, maybe.
Frightening. I mean, it can be a very frightening experience, I'm assuming, for most. So, whereas, having a few drinks and relaxing is far safer. Even though, like I said, it is sort of numbing you. But
you have to be willing to face your demons, as they say, metaphorically. I mean, it's not an escape.
No. It's not an escape.
So that's why it's not, someone that's interested in heroin or cocaine is not probably going to be as interested, or, they're not, they are mutually exclusive sometimes. It's a different kind of experience entirely, because you're facing your demons.
Yeah, for sure.
Not running away from them.
You're confronting. And I think that is why it has such an amazing... potential for problematic drug users or people with problematic personality disorders, such as predisposition towards violence, because it really is forcing you to look at yourself and some of the self-harm that you're doing. So someone who has, and that's why it's absurd that it wouldn't be a therapeutic option, because someone who's been an alcoholic for 30 years, who's drinking every day, is, that's a serious problematic drug user, and to say that you can't treat them with another drug because it's a drug, well, they're killing themselves with a drug anyway every day. So in order to as sort of a last ditch chance to get someone to change their behavior, psychedelic drugs should absolutely be an option, because especially heroin and alcohol are both dependency causing, which is so powerful for that addiction. Treatment options don't work well at all. So there's a lot of that. I think that for someone who's at the end of the rope with problematic drug use or problematic personality disorders should have the option of trying psychedelic drugs, unless they have a history of major mental illness. Major mental illness I would describe as being bipolar or schizophrenic or major depression, which are things that interfere with your sense of reality to begin with.
I mean, I guess my question is it really that cynical that the reason we're not having a lot of this is because there's just not money to be made from it, because some of these things aren't patentable, or they're in the public domain? Is it just a cynical situation like that? Is that the reason we're not doing it? Some lobbyists are keeping us from...
That's definitely part of it.
Sounds like conspiracy, but it makes sense. I mean, follow the money.
Yes. I mean, some conspiracy theories are a lot more reasonable than others. And I think that...
This fits. It's Occam's razor. Yeah, it works.
The simplest explanation. But I think that you're absolutely correct that THC and psilocybin are both public domain and are both non-patentable. So there is no profit incentive for pharmaceutical companies to get these substances. Also, mushrooms are a one-dose drug, so you don't have to take it every week. It's not like anxiety medication or depression medication, which you're on for a long period of time. They've been finding that one dose of mushrooms or LSD or ayahuasca has the same effect as a long period of time on an antidepressant.
Yeah, so clearly there's no money to be made there.
No money to be made. Just increasing happiness, but no cash.
So fuck that.
Exactly. No, we don't want that. I got to make some cash. If people are
I'll be happy.
If people are suffering, I want cash from it. So
so do some of your colleagues end up working for pharmaceutical companies?
No. Everyone who I've met in drug policy is working on the opposite. They're working for a think tank.
They didn't get hired by a lobby group.
No, not really. No. But I mean, it'd be nice though to like I'm not overly.
That would be a deal with the devil, wouldn't it?
Yeah. And I've had that thought, because I've wrote some research papers on alcohol and heroin, and I was wondering if the alcohol industry wanted me to write some pro-alcohol papers and what I would do. I don't know.
Yeah, that would be an amazing thing
We're
to
all
test yourself.
motivated by self-interest. I mean, I can't eat activism.
No. But you don't want to lie.
No. Yeah, and I'd like to make society better.
Mm-hmm. Clearly,
So,
I mean, you've chosen the path that you have. Mm-hmm.
So also there's a few interesting studies on what you mentioned before about flashbacks and problems associated with psychedelic drug use. Actually, something I would like to be on record to say is that there's a few different rules for taking psychedelics safely that I think if you follow, then you will have a good time, from what I've known from the research. So
what are they?
Those rules, traditionally people say set and setting. So most people have heard that before. Set means be in a good mood, or at least don't be in a really dark place in your life. Setting refers to the physical environment you're in. So being, and the people you're around. So if you're around safe people that you know and trust in a safe space where there's a decreased chance of chaos, like, police or something like that, then that is a much safer environment. But I would add a few additional things to that, which is dose. So, I mean, people have bad times on 10 hits of acid and usually not on one hit. So that makes a big difference. I would also include mixing drugs. So a lot of, and this is actually true for most things, that when people have a really bad time on drugs, such as like a bad trip or an overdose, it's from mixing, often with alcohol, because it's doing different things to your body. I think the data on overdose deaths was that it is mostly drug mixing, either heroin and stimulants or heroin and alcohol. And it's very rarely just heroin, which is something that I don't think people know too much about. So you have to always be careful mixing substances. And and also drug checking. So if you could ever have access to, there's test kits that you can use chemicals to ensure that what you have is what you think it is. So I think if you can obey all those rules of psychedelics, then you're not going to generally have too bad of a time. And also, like I said before, about family medical history, about background of schizophrenia and bipolar. But there's 2 different population level studies in America on the harms of drugs. So they did one of them had 200,000 people, another one had 250,000 people, and they were looking for flashbacks, suicidality, and HPDD, which means someone keeps hallucinating after the situation is over. And they found that people who had done psychedelic drugs, out of this 2 population studies, almost 500,000 people had better mental health outcomes and less suicidal behavior, whereas all other drugs, I believe it was all other, including marijuana and alcohol, had increased rates of mental health problems and increased rates of suicidality. And that they didn't find any evidence for flashbacks. So I went on the U of T database trying to find any evidence, hard evidence for flashbacks, and it doesn't exist.
Could you clarify, what do you mean by flashback? How are you using that term?
So I would say that while you are not under influence of the substance, you have a hallucinogenic experience.
That would seem like a bonus. It's
it's like you're still waiting for your free trip, right? That dealer owes you money. He promised flashbacks.
Well, the thing is, I actually remember having psychedelic experiences before I took any psychedelic drugs. I did have what I consider to be psychedelic experiences. I think they are possible.
I think that collective religious effervescence is something that is probably similar
it's a heightened state. Similar thing is probably going on in your brain. It's, what's to draw the differentiation? Really?
So dreaming. I mean, I don't know if you've ever...
Dreaming is a psychedelic state.
Pretty psychedelic. Yeah. There's a light when your light flashes before your eyes, things like that. When you see the light when before you're about to die. All of those things are sort of in the realm of human experience.
This is kind of another interesting framework to view the psychedelic state as well. Sometimes you can think of it as, it's like it always seems like you're always dreaming in the background, but you don't have access to it. You only have access to it when you fall asleep. It almost seems that way. So, but when you're on a psychedelic state, it's like you're given access to that. So you have your kind of dream going on at the same time as your experience, and sometimes if it's strong enough, they start to meld together and you have a hallucinating type experience. Which also makes me wonder, is that kind of the experience of a schizophrenic? Because that seemed to be how it was described to me, is that it's kind of a confusing of the dream state with your waking state. Mm-hmm. That kind of describes to me a psychedelic state in a way.
It could be. And I've heard that comparison made before. I mean, I don't know. It's impossible to get into the mind of a schizophrenic, and I'm sure it's quite different and unpleasant. But
right.
I do feel like that probably is some validity to that comparison, just in regards to
I wonder
that your sort of mind is seeing reality differently, and you're having thoughts that are different, and so on and so forth with that. Mm-hmm. But I'm not too sure.
Yeah, it's almost like the two channels are mixing, your dream and your waking state.
They're
which is informative.
So there's a psychedelic that I've been researching, which I'm very interested in. It's probably the worst drug in the world.
What's that?
As far as experience goes. And I want to talk about it briefly just to show that psychedelics are not this magical. They're just all positivity and love and fun. But there's a psychedelic called Datura, which is a classification of drug called a deliriant. There's a few other Datura and Brugmansia.
Sounds like comic book stuff.
And belladonna. So it's a classification of drug. It's a poison. It grows commonly in Europe and North America. It's a plant / weed that grows on the side of highways. And it has the drugs in atropine and scoleopamine, which are both extremely powerful neurotoxins. And the effects of the drug I find very interesting, though, because they sound so horrific.
Okay.
So there's an interesting website called Eroid. I don't know if you've ever heard of it. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So you can read about bad trips, good trips. You can learn all about drugs on that website. Mm-hmm. And I went through all of the Datura trip reports. Almost 99% were bad. And the main effects of the drug are that you take it and then you fall asleep and then you wake up and you don't know that you're high. And you stay high for between 1 and 3 days.
Holy cow.
And there's a lot of negative physical effects, but the main mental hallucinogenic effects are that you are existing in two realities at the same time. So you would meet me and you would be having this interview this discussion right now, but in my mind's eye, I'd be playing golf.
Well, see, that sounds fascinating and alluring, but what's the terrible part of it? Is it the...
Oh, yeah. Well, I'm not finished. Okay. Well, the terrible part would be that you don't know which reality is real. Right. So I could be talking with you and playing golf, and I don't know which one is actually true. So I could hit someone in the golf reality. That could be real or not, and I don't know. So there were some horrible stories about someone trying to commit suicide on Datura, and he was at the top of a building, and then he jumped off the building, and then he jumped onto his bed.
So it's kind of a persistence duality. Like, it doesn't just come and go.
No, and it's not like mushrooms or LSD, from what I understand, where you're still rooted in the space you are, and you know you're you're hallucinating.
Not always. I mean, what you described, I've experienced, but for short periods of time. It's not. But if it seems to persist for 2 or 3 days, I can see that being a problem.
Yeah. So that's only one of the effects too. So you're oscillating between these two realities, but you also are seeing whole scale hallucinations in front of you. So not just things such as like patterns, motions, seeing things in your mind's eye. You see like a full blown, Sasquatch or something like that, and you think that it's real the whole time. So from what I've talked to other people, they say, if you're on LSD, you're like, holy shit, I want LSD. This is crazy. You're tripping. For this one, it's like, oh, there's Sasquatch. I'm gonna have a conversation with him. And then another disturbing part of it is that you consistently see people and talk with people who are phantoms. So you'll see someone, you'll see your dead relative, you'll see some strangers, you'll see some people from the TV, and you'll talk with them for a long time, and then they'll disappear in front of you, and then you'll do the same again. And you keep on sort of talking to these phantoms that aren't real, which it sounds really scary to me.
Is that it? Is it because it lasts so long that... Because what you're describing to me is almost like a challenge for a psychonaut.
No. Trust me. I'm not doing my job talking you out of it then. But
because is it just the having...
Yeah, well, it's that also...
Because what I'm thinking is, if I imagine myself doing that, like in my house with a friend nearby to help, would it still be terrible?
It would still be terrible.
Right.
And a lot of the trip reports ended with someone waking up in a hospital strapped to a bed, being force-fed activated charcoal, which is something that can get poison out of your stomach. But it's the.
But here's the irony of it. There will be some people listening now that are going to say,
I wanna do it.
That's interesting.
Have you ever?
There's got to be, right? That's the nature of a communication. You can only speak your truth.
Listen to me.
People will be
hope
affected
not.
the way they're affected. It's not, that's up to you.
Okay, well, here's a few other things that
we can't hold in information because some people might not take well to it.
Well, let me give you the full information. Then that's all I can do. That it can make you go blind. That your pupils dilate to such a degree that you go blind for a few days. Wow. You can't swallow. It does something to your ability to swallow. So. It does that, and also it makes it so you can't urinate, so that you get really, really thirsty and keep trying to drink.
So who's actually doing this then?
Teenagers who can't afford,
like on a dare kind of a thing.
Yeah,
or
well,
what?
actually, have you ever heard of Carlos Castaneda and the Teachings of Don Juan? Those book series by the anthropologist. So he went and had this shamanic experience, and he described doing datura. And he described it. He described it as a very positive experience where he was flying, and then a lot of people after the book was written read about this and tried it, thinking that it would be this. And also the street name for it is Jimson weed, which sounds okay, but that comes from the fact that one of the early settlers in the United States at the Jamestown colony accidentally ate a whole bunch of datura. The whole colony did, and then they all went insane for 3 days.
Oh
so that's
God.
why they called it Jimson weed.
That would have been like the purge.
Yeah, exactly. The whole community. Yeah, but no, it's a very dangerous psychedelic. Also, you're not in control of yourself. And I think that a lot of the horror stories associated with LSD or other psychedelics actually may have come from datura use. Yeah, so it's like the dark family of psychedelics, and no one does it twice.
Yeah.
So if you make it through, I know you can die. Like a lot of people legitimately overdose, which is the opposite of mushrooms and LSD, which you physically cannot overdose from.
Right.
Yeah.
What do you know about DMT? That seems to be at the top of everyone's pyramid in terms of the psychedelic to try. I have done it a couple of times, but it seems like what do you know about that?
It's a very interesting drug. There's a Netflix documentary called. Do you remember the name of that?
Spirit Molecule, is that the one?
Yeah, that's right. It's Spirit Molecule, which is the title of the book written by Rick Strassman, who was a researcher who's done the only clinical research on DMT, which was in the 1990s in America, I believe, or it might have been England, I can't remember. But yeah, DMT seems to be very unique. It's the second active ingredient in ayahuasca, so it's related to ayahuasca. The experience of it seems fascinating in the sense that it almost seems like science fiction dream state where you go into, but it's unique because LSD lasts 12 hours. Datura, like I said, could last 72 hours. Mushrooms about 6. But DMT only about 15 minutes, with the actual drug action being only a few minutes where you're hallucinating. So, but yeah, the common theme of DMT where you smoke it, and then they have what you call a breakthrough, and then you go into like a dream-like sort of, they call it hyperspace, which is what the users call it, and you sort of interact with other worlds. And one of the common themes of it is that you interact with entities or like alien minds or alien life, and they speak to you in another language and they tell you things. And so even though it only lasts about 5 minutes where you're in that state, it actually can feel like hours. Wow,
it's funny. While you were describing that, I was recalling my first DMT trip, and I think I was recalling more than I had before. Interesting.
What? Well, that's just what I read some passages from the book, The Spirit Molecule, and some of it sounded absolutely fascinating. This one guy said that he was gone for like 1,000 years, but it was only 15 minutes. That sounds a little scary. I don't know if I want to live an extra 1,000 years in hyperspace.
It's a Star Trek episode,
right? Yeah, exactly. The DMT realm. So it is pretty.
Well, for me, it looked animated. It looked like Matt Groening had drawn the universe. Everyone was kind of like a Simpsons character. A couple of my friends around me, and everything was like Lisa Simpson's bedroom. That's what it looked like.
That sounds pretty interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow.
So what's common now with psychedelic rhetoric that I've been seeing around is a lot of ayahuasca retreats, which is an interesting sort of thing because I've sort of casually talked to people when they learn that I wrote an article on psychedelics for mental health, and then they start saying, "Oh, I want to try ayahuasca and go to one of these retreats for my anxiety." Which, again, there is a lot of research showing that ayahuasca has a lot of therapeutic potential similar to mushrooms and LSD, but ayahuasca, from my research, shows that it's very physically demanding. And again, it lasts a long time. I have a friend who took it, and he said he had hemorrhoids after because it makes you go to the bathroom for so long.
It does.
You throw
Clean you
up,
out.
or
Yeah.
So he said he had a physically challenging experience. So
That's very true.
sometimes when I talk to people who are like, "Oh, I want to try this ayahuasca thing," I said, "Well, maybe try a small dose of mushrooms first to
That's
get
better.
your toe in the water."
I think you
maybe.
should be probably in very good shape and have a lot of experience with psychedelics before you do ayahuasca.
Right.
It's not something you just do on a whim.
Yeah, that's kind of what
It's
I was
not
trying
recreational, man.
to say. But no, absolutely not. And that's the thing with psychedelic drugs. I mean, they're not exactly recreation. You don't take them and go to a party. At least I don't think you should. So, but it seems like there's an interesting thing with this ayahuasca tourism, where it's turning into sort of like a in sort of thing to do for wealthy tourists.
Well,
to
it'll always be
Peru.
that. That's always going to be the case. But there will be some good from that as well. Even the people that just go for, signaling how cool they are, they might have a profound experience that's going to change them anyway. So
2 weeks ago, I was in British Columbia attending a conference on the opioid overdose epidemic. So through my work for the Canadian Students for Sensible Drug Policy, I'm also involved in a group called the Canadian Drug Policy Coalition, which is sort of a think tank organization, but it's probably the premier drug policy sort of organization in Canada. It's headed by a man named Donald McPherson, who is sort of very involved in Canadian drug policy over the years, maybe the godfather of drug policy, maybe.
Wow.
Yeah, so I was invited to this conference. It was all about injection sites and consumption sites, overdose prevention, and scaling up the services. So there's going to be 3 coming to Toronto. I believe, I'm not sure how many in Montreal. I think 3, 1 in Ottawa. So I'm not actually very positive on those numbers, but I know that they will be proliferating. And so yeah, I went to when I was in British Columbia, I went to the Dr. Peter Center. I don't know if you've ever heard of that.
No.
It's so you have Insight, which is the injection site since 2003 that's been running. I think it has the most academic articles written about. There's just a huge amount of academic articles written about Insight showing that it works. All this public pressure to make sure it works. But the Dr. Peter Center was another one. It was another injection site that's been running, I believe, since the early 2000s. I know less about the Dr. Peter Center, but I visited it. And what I saw was pretty amazing. It was sort of like a community center type of place, which had the worst possible, not the worst possible, but very high risk, vulnerable injection drug using people. So people usually with HIV, people have been dependent on opiates for a pretty long time. And it was amazing. It was honestly one of the best experiences of my life, going there and seeing what they were doing for those people that they had. And it kind of goes back to my belief about problematic drug use being, connected to so many other things, because what they had there it wasn't like moral condemnation or like that type of counseling where they're trying to get it. It was like they had a music room where people would go and play guitar and the drums, and then they had a paint room where you could paint, and then they had a therapy dog. They had spectacular, really interesting social workers and nurses. And when I was talking to the social workers there, they're saying that traditional psychotherapy is very difficult for that population. That especially for some of the men, it's very hard to open up and talk about those.
So that's still the case, right? It seems like I gotta believe that it's better for younger generations than it was for my generation, and mine was better than my dad's generation. I like to think it's continuing the progress that
For men being
Men are more
closed,
open,
yeah,
about this kind of stuff. I
Yeah,
don't
that's
know. I hope that's
definitely
the
an
case.
issue.
Yeah.
No, it's an issue. But so what they would do is they would get the person to come in, and instead of saying, what happened in your childhood, what type of trauma did you experience, like, what are the factors that led you here, they would say, could you draw a picture of your house growing up? And then that would be the therapy. And then, so it would be like, they would get that, draw a picture, which is associating maybe some of the trauma that occurred. So, it was just really kind of like humane, based on interpersonal connection, like helping people where they are, as opposed to being ideal about it, and no criminal prosecution for any of it. And it was just a really interesting, I'd love to see that type of service scaled up for that population, because in my opinion, that is something that could actually help them, as opposed to, like, definitely imprisoning people for drug use is the least effective policy that you can do.
Yeah. I mean, no way. And it can be therapeutic. And just what you were saying a minute ago, I had a very recent trip in which I did realize something about my childhood that allowed me to finally, in a sense, cry about it. And I don't think I would have gotten there without the psychedelics. And it was kind of an important realization that, when I came across as an immigrant child at the age of 5, that it was stressful, that it was traumatic. Like, I'd never admitted that to myself. That, it's basically like you're going to another planet that's barely breathable, and you got to somehow just get by. You're always kind of hyper vigilant, and it felt like you were under siege. And you got kind of related to the kids that we see, the Syrian refugees going across, and you see 5-year-old kids huddled on the boat, and you think, oh shit, I know what they're going through, as momentarily. So that's an important realization.
And that's going to affect them their whole lives, those experiences. And it's something about mental health that in my own personal experience is that if you have a mental health problem, nobody can help you. And that's just how it is. And I can't help you, and you can't help me, and it's in your own head and your own experiences. And not the most amazing psychotherapist in the world can't help you.
So this is tough love coming, I hear. Is it?
This is tough love.
Okay.
Eat some mushrooms and deal with it. So, but generally speaking, I mean, your family can help you, your friend, your support network can help you, psychotherapists can help you. Exercise can help you, all those things, but at the end of the day, no one can crack your head open.
So you got to help yourself. Is that what you're saying?
You got to help yourself, and also, it's a part of existence. I mean, you're saying being an immigrant child, but I don't know, maybe it's just the experience of coming out of the womb that causes all that. I mean, who knows? I think part of the human experience is brutality and suffering, and probably a good way to alleviate that could be through psychedelics and that type of alternative perspective and seeing things differently.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's an inherent value there in itself to see things from a different perspective, I would say. So that's mainly the argument for psychedelics, I think. Like I mentioned before, I recently wrote an article on alcohol, so I wouldn't mind talking about
legal drugs for a little bit if you.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, so I wrote an article recently about the new Ontario alcohol sales policies, which is that they're going to be selling beer and wine in about 300 new locations in Ontario.
Oh, yeah.
Which I am arguing against, saying that it will increase harm in Ontario and Canada in general. So alcohol costs the Canadian government about $14.6 billion a year. In costs, which is about, I think, $3 billion justice system, $4 billion healthcare, $7 billion lost production. Tobacco costs the government $17 billion a year, which is largely from lung cancer deaths. And all illegal drugs combined cost the Canadian government $8 billion a year. So the bulk of the harm, so the $31 billion a year from alcohol, tobacco, about $8 billion a year from heroin, coke, psychedelics. So we can clearly see.
So clearly where you have to focus on.
Right, yeah. I mean, it's not necessarily the mandate of my drug policy groups, which is more about illicit narcotics and reform on that front. But in my opinion, as someone who's studied some public policy, if you really want to actually decrease harm, and harm reduction is the mantra, then you need to go after alcohol. Because alcohol has such a powerful externalities to the economy and to society, because it doesn't just harm individual drinkers, but other people and society at large. So I found...
Yeah, so if you're listening, give up alcohol. Start on the pot.
No. Start on the DMT. So you
go right to the top.
Put your wine down and pick up the Datura.
White wine or DMT, I don't know.
All you children listening, Datura is fine, wine is bad.
And pets. Leave them around.
I'm kidding.
Of course.
All drugs can be good or bad. So, but the interesting thing too is alcohol is a factor in 30% of all crime in Canada. So,
a lot of fights.
A lot of violence.
Nobody fights when they're on pot, it seems.
No, not really. Yeah, if you were to have,
it'd be silly.
If each bar in Toronto was full of pot smokers instead of people drinking, I mean, the amount of assaults and homicides and sexual assaults.
They'd be arm in arm singing old Irish tunes.
Or just eating chicken wings and getting drowsy. I don't know, but I know that pharmacologically, alcohol has a few unique effects, which makes it weird that it's most socially acceptable, because really the effects of it are decreased ability to assess risky situations and dangerous situations, and a decreased ability to make good decisions.
Right.
So a lot of times...
And to be assholes.
Yeah, and to be assholes, and to get aggressive. And I do think, a lot of people maybe who are listening going, oh, how dare you? I have a few glasses of wine, I'm fine, which is probably true for most. Yeah. Right? But I still think you have to just look at the widespread use, and people with personality dispositions who are predisposed to violence or aggression that can trigger it and bring it out. Or people use alcohol as an excuse to do those type of things. Like, I know I'm going to get into a fight tonight, better binge drink. But also I think this is a moderately controversial topic, but alcohol is by far the drug used most in the facilitation of date rape and sexual assault.
Right, yeah.
So
That's the asshole part, yeah.
One of my criminology professors did some original research on GHB and Rohypnol and drugs that you serendipitously slip into women's drinks at bars.
Gross.
Yeah, which she found so there was a study where there was 1,000 women who reported a rape in England, and then they took their blood that day. And out of the 1,000, I think it was like less than 1% showed GHB. Now, GHB goes out of your bloodstream fast, so that's a caveat. However, the evidence really shows that it's alcohol. So, I mean, if you have 10 drinks in a row, that's basically the same effect as what you would experience under a date rape drug.
So, knock you out.
Yeah, my criminologist professor's theory on that was that since people shame women who are the victim of a sexual assault for willful consumption of alcohol, they will use the date rape narrative to garner support, which they should have no matter what. So nobody anywhere deserves to be assaulted or sexually assaulted. But drinking until intoxication is a very significant risk factor for that vulnerability.
Yeah, you're making yourself more vulnerable.
Yeah, 100%.
Also to make stupid decisions and harm others. But
right,
yeah.
Exactly. So, I had a group of female friends who would cover their drinks while in a bar. And, I guess it makes sense, like it's the way it is, but then they would have 10 drinks. And then so I'm not sure, they're as...
So they self-dosed.
So they self-dosed entirely, and we're so vulnerable. And then, they see a hot guy in the bar, and then it's, so I feel scared about that. Like you're putting yourself into such a vulnerable situation. You don't know, this like acquaintance people. Oh, he's a friendly guy. So I don't know, but it's a slightly controversial opinion, which I respect, because then they say, oh, you're blaming women now for drinking. But I don't think it's necessarily blame as it is looking at the evidence based on alcohol and crime.
Yeah, it's good advice for any gender. Just don't fucking do too much of it.
Yeah, any gender, absolutely. And for men, if I get really drunk and I'm in a bar, my odds of getting into a fight and getting assaulted are definitely raised too. So I'm not saying I don't deserve to be assaulted or stabbed or robbed, but if I drink 10 drinks in the area, I don't know, the guys I don't know, my odds of getting hurt are rising.
Yeah, you got to know that.
Yeah. So I think that's interesting point about and also so I mentioned about the economic costs. So alcohol is a factor in 30% of all crime and between 50 and 65% of all sexual assaults. And all drugs combined are only a factor in 5% of police-reported crime. So again, alcohol just surpasses all illegal drugs again, like by a huge amount.
Yeah, there seems to be this huge disconnect again from what seems obvious and reasonable to a lot of us and what's actually public policy.
And people get mad at me when I talk like this about alcohol, which is always funny when I talk about legalizing heroin and heroin-assisted treatment, and people are okay with that. But then I talk about decreasing alcohol availability and making alcohol slightly more expensive, and people get pissed. How dare you? Like, who are you to say that I can't get cheap wine from the corner store?
Yeah.
So, but
and it will be cheap wine. It'll probably be the shitty cheap wine that everyone's going to stock. So
I'm a strong supporter of the traditional Canadian monopoly on alcohol due to the fact, and it's the same thing with it's the same logic with cigarettes. That the government should not be promoting or expanding cigarette use because it costs so much to taxpayers. It's the same logic with alcohol, but we haven't had that shift towards alcohol.
Yeah, I'm kind of I can't quite decide about that because I'm against regulations like that. Generally, I'd like to be open, but it's working well. That one might be the only argument that I might support it. It's working well, right, the way it is, really.
Well, when you have the capitalist, and it's the same thing that if we were to legalize all drugs. If we were to legalize all drugs, the government has to be in charge of that. For the same reason that the government has to be in charge of alcohol, that they don't want it to be proliferated. They don't want people to go to jail for drinking. So prohibition of alcohol is a failure.
What do you mean the government has to be in charge of it? What do you mean? Like what?
Wait, so for one of the, so when you introduce the profit motive, then you want people to sell as much as possible. So you have two convenience stores across the street from each other, like a Starbucks and a Second Cup, and they're going to do whatever they can to sell more. So that's selling to youth without IDs, is that putting lowered pricing, discount times, and then the consumption rate goes up.
But there is a profit motive in there in the sense that the directors of this organization are instructed to make a profit, and they would behave like a corporation, and they will make the profit that they need to make to to be successful.
Yeah, but when the government has a monopoly,
it's just the money goes to us in this case.
Yeah.
So you could say, okay, go for it.
And the government has a better ability to plan for density, right? So if it's capitalist motive, then it goes wherever the market is. So you would have a whole ton of liquor stores in one community like Kensington Market. You would have very few outside. When the government gets to plan where alcohol retail outlets are, it's a lot more like it's not so dense, it's not so cheap, it's not so available. So while they have, you can't buy alcohol past 9 o'clock most places, they still have the Sunday laws. All those things do decrease consumption.
You're some kind of communist.
I have a friend who's a libertarian who thinks this argument makes him sick.
I have problems with it, but I get it. Yeah, like I'm always between a libertarian and being like a smart, interventionist in some sense.
Yeah. Well, I mean, like, I think the key takeaway is alcohol is not like wheat. It's not a regular commodity. It's not something that should be dictated by market principles because of the external cost to society and taxpayers. Yeah. So that's that. I like alcohol though. And that's a funny thing too. Everyone's like, "Hey, didn't I see you at the bar?" So.
Yeah, I never got into it. Thankfully, seems like. I don't know. Like I said, it's my least favorite drug.
Being hungover is incredible. I mean, that's the cost.
The nausea for me is the thing. Like if it ever reaches the level of nausea, I can't deal with it. To me, that's like the worst torture.
It really is not.
I hate that.
The effects of it last a long time and are pretty severe. And at least now that I'm getting a little longer in the tooth, I can't drink so much. Like back when I was 19, 20, I could go all weekend partying, and now I have a little more, and I don't feel so good.
So, with the research that you've done into these psychedelics, how much is too much? Because you said it doesn't have a toxicity in a sense. So, could someone do acid every day? Is there a limit to something? But there's an efficacy, I think, goes down. Is that essentially it?
Yeah. Psychedelics, I'm not sure about the others, but I know for psilocybin mushrooms that they have an incredibly high tolerance build up, so that if you do mushrooms today, you cannot get high off them tomorrow.
Right.
And that it is nearly impossible to become dependent on psychedelics. So, I mean, it's impossible to become physically dependent on marijuana. You can get psychologically addicted to marijuana. Same thing with cocaine, actually. It's not a physically dependent drug. It's psychologically dependent.
Yeah.
But no, I mean, I read on Erowid a story about someone snorting a whole bunch of crystallized LSD that turned out to be an insane amount and living. And so being like in the hospital for a long time, but then coming out and
I think you need like 1,000+ hits or something for it to even
I don't know,
kill you or something.
Break your brain.
If it can.
But I don't know. I don't want to experience such a
Let's
thing.
not try that.
But I would say, everybody's different. And, I've known some people who can do a lot of substances and be okay and functioning and normal.
I think I always kind of fuck that up because I kind of stay away for a little while. But when I start again, I have such a positive experience with it that I start to do it too soon, like too small a gap between each one. And it seems to kind of contract very quickly. And I kind of get into this mode where I'm doing it very frequently for a week or two. And then, I admit, I get a little frazzled. I get dissociated a little bit. And that's usually a time to back off again. But so it's hard to find that balance, like to leave the gap, what that adequate gap is. And for me, it seems to get too short every time.
Well, a friend of mine is very adamant about something he calls integration after the experience. So, you have some type
I don't
of...
allow myself that.
No. Yeah, keep going.
Yeah, that's a problem.
But he said, you have these thoughts and experiences, and like you said, sort of about the childhood realization, about sort of the trauma of being an immigrant in a new country, that you need to take some time after that and write it down in a journal, go see a therapist and talk about it,
Mention something. Mention it in a podcast, maybe.
Yeah, talk about it. Tell your local police force.
Put it on, but
Yeah, so I think
polls.
That's an important thing.
Yeah.
About the police, I am not anti-police. A lot of people would think I am, maybe because of my drug policy reform stance.
Do not fuck the police.
No.
Don't fuck the police.
I have some family members who are police officers, and I respect...
Like any profession. You could have assholes or not.
Absolutely,
you can't paint everyone with the same brush.
One of the frustrating things about drug prohibition and criminalization is how much leeway it gives the police. So... what you said, you can get a police officer who's having a bad day, who is low on his arrest rate, who wants to lock people up for a joint on the street. And then you could have another police officer who is out for community policing. He wants to help people, and he catches some teenagers with pot and he throws it away and he says, so it's very discretionary, which makes it extremely scary, in my opinion, that they don't have this sort of uniform policy for dealing with substance users.
It's such a great opportunity there to actually have police that would be actually trained to deal with this shit in the way that they should. Imagine what great effect it could have on that the group of people that they're in contact with all the time. It's crazy.
I think that drug criminalization has damaged community-based policing almost irreparably.
Yeah, no kidding.
Because one of my relatives who's a police officer told me that one of the most harmful things is that every time he as a police officer sees people, they get really scared and nervous and treat him like an asshole.
Yeah.
And he said that, if you deal with that every day, that rubs off on you.
Yeah, no doubt.
So,
it's got to do something to your psyche.
The pressure that the police officers are under. But the reason that we are so scared of police officers is because we're scared they're going to book us or they're going to arrest us for that joint we have. So if we didn't have that fear, if you're walking and you say, I didn't rob a house, I didn't pass a bad check, I didn't steal a TV from Walmart.
You'd have no reason for anxiety if
it
wasn't for drugs in many cases.
Exactly. Yeah. So when the police are arresting people for personal consumption of what they're going to do anyway, and then when you go to jail, you're not, changing your ways, and you're coming out and you're doing drugs anyway when you get out, because drug crimes have the highest recidivism rate for all crimes. That, it's just not an effective way to...
That's stupid as hell. Because, obviously, like, I don't buy it on the street, so I'm never going to get arrested, whereas somebody else who has to is going to. So it's hardly evenly applied anyway.
Yeah, no, that's a really astute point as well, because, it's very, very class, race, and gender-based.
Absolutely.
And that if you look at drug arrests, there's some very notable and clear discrepancies of who is being arrested and what drugs are being arrested for, and the gender of who's arrested, and the racial group of who's arrested. So it's definitely applied. I've seen some theories about that poorer people are more likely to sell outside, whereas wealthier people are more likely to drug deal inside. So that can lead to a cycle of arresting more poor people because it's easier. So
that's easy to see. Yeah,
some different theories regarding that. There's a group called LEAP, which is Law Enforcement Against Prohibition. I think they recently changed their name, but it's an organization of retired and current police officers who are against drug prohibition. Because the police have to deal with the public, and the public consists of a lot of different demographics. One of those demographics is violent and dangerous people. It's a very small percentage. It's probably, I'd say, if I had to guess, maybe like 8 to 12% of males and 1 to 3% of females who have.
That's a lot of dudes.
Yeah, who have personality disorders, who have low-level mental health, and whatever the causes are. I'm sure there are structural causes to these people, or maybe not. It could be personality, like the way you're born. But
well, let's be clear: dudes are the problem.
I don't know. I'm not. I mean, like I gave those 90% of all violent crime is committed by men, and that's almost a universal between time and space of all cultures. Yeah. So there is something about. And I don't know if it's just social. I mean, it could be due to testosterone.
Men in their teens and 20s seem to be the issue, so clearly it's related to something like that.
Yeah, and I had this conversation actually with a female friend of mine about profiling, and that if you don't profile young men, it's not good for your survival instinct.
Right,
so
exactly.
If I'm walking down the street at night and I see a group of 19-year-old males, or I see
pack of hyenas,
or I see 3 65-year-old females, right. I mean, who is more likely to violently victimize me? Yeah. I mean, let's be realistic.
It's human nature. You're going to make those sort of things.
And you
subconsciously,
should.
Maybe. Even.
And you absolutely should. I mean, if you treat men and women as the same likelihood of committing violent crimes, you're just wrong. It's inaccurate. So, yeah.
You're 29 years old.
Yeah.
Yeah. I was thinking that's about the age group where I was around 27. Yeah. I started to feel like an adult. I felt like
I'm scared of 15 to 35-year-old males. Yeah, I would say that's. Yeah. So I still have six more years. I could still violently victimize you. Yeah.
Demographically speaking,
which I love demographics. One of my recent professors worked for the Canadian census, so as someone who's in sociology, I like to group people and then analyze them. It's kind of what you do.
So big data must excite you.
It does, yeah.
Yeah. Have you had any experience with that? Have you?
I had a class on public opinion and how people vote, and I used aggregate survey data from the Canadian Election Survey as well as the World Value Survey. And for that paper, I found out that Catholics in Canada vote Liberal. And it's a mystery as to why. And that atheists...
Because you would expect them to be more conservative, is that?
Yeah.
I think most Catholics are those holiday Catholics, that's why.
Yeah, it could be that. And people who are atheists vote NDP.
Yeah, I guess so.
So I do like aggregate data. My job on these research projects is to turn verbal data into written data, which later will be coded and turned into a data set. Yeah, so I appreciate that, and it's not foolproof in being able to explain the social world, but it's the evidence you can gather, right? So survey data.
Have you been reading about this Cambridge Analytica or Cambridge Analytics?
No, what's that?
This company that I think was hired by certain political movements to work on their behalf, which was to find out in great detail about you, for example, and then customize a political persuasion to you. And what Dave said was that if you have 150 points on somebody, what you've liked, what you've searched for, 150 data points about you, that they will know you better than most of your friends do. That if they have 300 data points on you, they will know you better than yourself. And in this case, they have 500 data points on everybody already. So they're able to just customize you towards a political direction and then eventually change your mind about something.
I agree with that. I agree with
scary.
that. So sociodemographics are the best predictors.
Yeah. So when you learn about something, you start to learn how take control of the means of affecting those things that you're learning about. And
right.
That's a scary part of government.
Yeah. So when I was doing that public opinion research paper, I think that if I know 10 pieces of information about your sociodemographics, I can predict how you vote. Mm-hmm. So, if you're man versus a woman, if you're poor versus rich, and that is, a cutoff of a certain income category, if you have a post-secondary degree versus not, the way your parents voted, your race, your gender, all those things, if I know them, I think that I could predict how you would vote to a fairly close accuracy.
Oh, even more than that, it seems. Like they could get into your subconscious beliefs about things that you're not even clear yourself about. That seems like that's the level of granularity they're able to get to. And that's only going to get more and more.
Which it makes it funny because we think we're such individuals. We're like, no, you don't know me. I could believe this or that.
A data set could represent you quite well.
Quite accurately, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, not to 100%, but close enough that they could predict your responses.
Or to manipulate you, which...
or that, yeah.
So those conspiracy nut jobs are starting to become more and more real.
Do you cover the camera on your laptop there?
I do, yeah.
Oh, you do? Okay. I don't.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if I should.
I just always have.
Is someone watching
Because I know it's
me?
easy to do. No, it's just, it can be done very easily.
It can be?
Yeah. It always has been.
So someone might have been watching me this whole time.
It's just they would never have a reason to watch you, probably. But it could be.
How do you know?
But Facebook does. This is not something they deny. They do turn. When you're putting your status update in, they turn on the microphone and listen to what you're listening to on the TV or on the radio, and they make assumptions based on that and add that to your data set. So they're learning everything about you, like what the environment is. And then the cameras could be also turned on, and certain AI makes some judgments about your environment every now and then.
Well, you know what? I find that thrilling. Let them watch.
You exhibitionist. You.
Yeah, I enjoy it. Sure. Let big government see the naked truth.
Well, it's more the Googles and the Facebooks that are going to know everything. It's not so much the government, really.
Which is funny.
The corporations.
On Facebook, when they give you targeted advertisements.
Yeah. Oh, it's way targeted now.
They used to give me a bunch of random ones, and I'd be like, I'll never buy this product. But now I'm seeing products that I know is targeted towards my Google searches.
Crazy.
So I'm like, you know what? I love that telescope. Like say I've been looking at stuff on space, and then I get to see some interesting. I'm like, oh, you know what? I like this, but it's very creepy. Yeah. Now imagine they start feeding you articles that make you like telescopes, and then they put that. Yeah, there's that loop going on. Information and advertising. Who knows? Yeah, they just want all my money.
Something. It's about control, I guess. Yeah, the limits of control. Well, thank you very much for coming in, Kyle. That was a great conversation.
Thank you very much. Anytime. I enjoyed it. I hope that I represented the drug policy stuff well. And
you did.
All of the opinions that I expressed are mine.
Give you a high five.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thanks
so
very much,
have a good day.
You too. Take care.